Yep, it is. That's exactly what we do every Wednesdays, just after 11. Our friend Katie Mohamed is in the studio. Good morning, Katie Mohamed. How are you doing?
Good morning, Sam. I'm well, thank you.
Oh, great. So for our new listeners, if you're joining us, we're on this mission to learn together. What is your mission, Katie?
My mission for Winning Women Wednesday, I mean, that's like a tongue twister, is to celebrate, uplift and empower women globally. Because when women win, we all win.
100%. And you know, when you originally came up with the name, I had to go home and practice it.
Yeah, because everybody was saying the other way around. It was saying, what's it?
Women win.
It's a Winning Women Wednesday, but people were saying Women Win Wednesday. Women are not only winning on Wednesday, we're winning every day.
100%. Okay.
So
it'll be remiss of us to not acknowledge that we are in the middle of Women's Month.
Absolutely.
Moving there.
Yeah, so I would say Molweni, Dumelang, Sanimbonani, and welcome to a special edition of Winning Women Wednesday. And as Sam said, I'm Katie Mohamed. So this month is our South African Women's Month. Although we have the 9th of August as the South African Women's Day, but hey, we women, we get a whole month to celebrate us. But I think it's more than a date on the calendar. Today, I would like to talk about the memory and the strength of the women that created this day. And you know, again, I talk about fun stuff on some days. And last week we spoke about Pan-African Women's Day. And again, I said to the guys in the studio, it was an education. And it was historical education. And I think today it's going to be another historical education. And I think it's about, we want to talk about the resistance and the resilience of the women that came before us. And again, we spoke last week about her story.
As opposed to history.
Yes. So let's talk about her story, just not one in the textbook, but the story that lives in every South African woman. And let's remember that we as women, we want to reflect, but we also want to rise together. So the 9th of August marks something very deep. I want us to believe that it's more than just hashtags. Because it was when in 1956, where 20,000 women marched to the Union buildings in Pretoria, black, white, colored, Indian, mothers with babies on their backs, domestic workers, and there were nurses and teachers and students, and all standing in silent protest against laws that have tried to control their movement and their dignity. And they left their petitions and they still stood in silence. And when the silence broke, their voices rose in one of the most iconic chants in our history. Watinta abafazi, watinta mbakodo. When you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And one woman who marched that day said, "We weren't afraid. We were tired, but we are tired of being invisible." And that is why we honor this day, not as a holiday, but as a calling, because we look back not only with nostalgia, but with clarity, and we ask ourselves, what are we marching for today?
Powerful question. What are we marching for today?
I think for me, it's about more than it's about remembering. It's about honoring the women that we celebrate. That we are celebrating, but it's also about It's about continuously talking about the women that are on the front lines, the women that are in the classrooms, the women that are in the clinics, the women that are in the council meetings that are making a difference in their communities, the women that are in the kitchen, and the creative studios like us here. And in this time, before we go forward, we need to remember the women that stood on that line. The mum Lillian Ngoyi.
Yeah.
She was the mother of the black resistance. Mum Albertina Sisulu, right, who was the nurse and he was the activist, and she was the matriarch of the movement. And Charlotte Maxeke, our first black woman university graduate. Imagine that.
And one hospital has been named after.
Yes, and one of South Africa's earliest feminists. So yes, we have the names of the scene women, but we also think about the unseen women, the Mama Dudu in Soweto, who raised generations through her kitchen setups, or Zanele, who is the young coder breaking barriers in tech, or Tando, the nurse who walked. During the pandemic, there was a young lady called Tando, and she walked every day 10 kilometers to help people breathe in the pandemic. So if you look at all of those, so we are celebrating and honoring a lot of the women. And let's not forget Mum Sophie de Bruyn, who's one of the 4 women that are still alive.
Yes.
And she was the youngest leader in the 1956 march. And she's legendary. And she reminds us...
I've interviewed her, actually.
Oh, wow. Well done.
Yeah.
She reminds us that we weren't just marching for ourselves. We were marching for every generation that would come after us. And that is us. So when we talk about Helen Joseph and Rahima Musa, fearless activists, we talk about our domestic workers. We talk about the women in the STEM sectors. We realize that legacy is not only statues. It's the small daily act of defiance that we are doing. And if we look at, have we ever thought about why this activism? And I know we think about the march first, and we think about the march being a march of, we do not want to carry a Dom pass. But have you ever thought further to what are the other activisms that they were focused on at that time?
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple. It was even in terms of language as a means of instruction. It was the right to associate with who you like. So there wasn't just the historical stuff that we're aware of, but it had knock-on effects for everything else.
And they weren't just women's issue. The Dompa wasn't women's issues.
No, it was everyone issue who was not white at the time.
And it was access to education.
Yeah.
It was...
And it wasn't just access to education. It was even within the education was the right to be instructed in your language.
Because we had something called the Bantu education, and then we had everybody else. And then it was land disposition, because at that time that was a big one.
And it's still an issue now.
It is still an issue now.
But in a different way now, because now we're talking about restoration of that land and what would it look like.
And also labor exploitation at that time.
100%, which still happens today, by the way.
So if you think about that, it was really not only a women's issue, but the women fought in the front lines for us. And during apartheid, between 1948 and 1994, these women... I think, and many at that time, and I would remember that Mam Winnie was imprisoned at that time, and she became a symbol of strength and defiance. So these are the women that were undervalued, even with the male liberation at that time. So it's kind of a very deeper thing. So what Women's Day meant was a reminder of resistance, a commemoration of courage, and a rallying point for unity in a deeply fractured country at that time. So if you look at when we received the day, 9th of August, it was 1995.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Wow.
It was in 1995.
That we officially recognized the 9th of August
as the Women's Day. Only in 1995. Wow. And it was, of course, the democratic elected government that gave us National Women's Day, 9th of August, and it became a public holiday. And it was also to recognize the role of women in the struggle, and also role of women that are continuously building a nation.
But I do want to commend South Africa, though. I mean, I know it's taken forever, but I do want to commend the fact that if we consider our first democratically held election was 1994, to have that day recognized for women a year later, it just also shows how progressive we are. It's taken other countries much longer than a year, than 12 months, to put a date on the calendar for women. So I just want to recognize that, because it was a very tumultuous period in our history. You know, we were now coming to deal with this idea that we could be free, but we might have had the ability to vote, but we haven't been really free in our minds and what that meant, because we were coming through the 90s, which was an incredibly difficult time for most South Africans. And there was a lot of other stuff happening, by the way, commissions and all the other things that was going on.
I think the most important part is that the women came from the resistance, and it was important to honor us because we came from there. So, and I wouldn't want to take that away from the women that stood up there. But if you look at what it was further than than just our matriarchs. It became celebrating the progress of women in parliament, because we had the first Speaker of the House who was a woman. And then female judges. We, at that time, started taking female judges.
And we had, at some point, Zuma had a policy in place. I mean, for all the faults, he was one of the first presidents to recognize that there should be a fair representation between men and women. And actually, under Zuma's leadership, we pushed it to 50% representation of women in parliament.
Yeah. And plus, we had the pressure on ensuring that we had female CEOs. And we had athletes out there. We had a lot of representation. And the most important, another important thing is that we started addressing the systemic biases, the gender-based violence, wage inequality, underrepresentation in tech and finance, and reproductive rights. And I think it became more than just what our matriarchs were fighting for. So the key milestones in that evolution was policy shifts that we were speaking about now, which is the Commission for Gender Equality, because that was when it was established. Corporate inclusion, more women in leadership. And of course, the narrative changed not only for women, but also you saw the rise in the Gen Z and the millennials at that time. They started getting a voice. And I think that also helped shape women's experiences as well. So we definitely had the youth voices. And so we moved also from legacy to innovation. So people were marching back in the days in the 1950s and 60s, and then we started building platforms, podcasts, policy measures, and so those tools that changed, and that's why W Suite for me was part of a movement.
Let me ask you this question, because I think a couple of weeks ago, it might be 2.5 months ago, you did this very interesting segment on the differences between the women of today and the women of yesteryear, and you quite eloquently highlighted what's the difference between the current generation and the past generation. But here's a question I want to ask. Do women of today understand the work of Mama Winnie, Lillian, Helen? Do they understand the work they did in order for them to be who they are today? Do you, just because I know, the reason I'm asking you facilitate a fair amount of conversations, dialogues, engagements, activism work in women's spaces. You have this very strong theme of the table, opening up the spaces around the table. And because you engage with women across the age spectrum, and I know there's a fair amount of young women, do you see that connection?
Not a lot. And I think if we talk through about the Gen Zs, and the Alpha generation, I don't think they know the power of the women in those years. The way we can do it, I can say I have a mentor, Ntabi Mujaji, and she is an academic. So she is, I think Ntabi is probably about 28, 29, and she's able to talk so deeply about the women that came before us, because she's studying it, and she talks to the youth. But the current generation, Amanda down the road, or Sahefa somewhere, Palesa, I don't think they would know there's a mum. There's a mum Winnie, but they don't realize the amount of days that she was in prison, what the struggle that she was. And I know that the younger generation, especially the Gen Zs, don't want to talk about that, because they feel that we need to move forward. But in order for us to move forward, we have to know where we come from. So the most important thing is, I'd like to know, what does the curriculum, the history curriculum in our schools have when it comes to talking about predominantly the legacy, predominantly the women, and that is where we need to start. We need to start with our schools. And yes, the conversations between us as mothers, we need to entrench that in conversations, because that it is. But I think more more so not only watching documentaries, but also watching content that we are creating. Make sure that we continuously bring the women, and then people say, who was that? Who was that? Why is Rahima Musa, why is there a street of Rahima Musa in Tshwane, and why there's a hospital named after her? Or why there's a Charlotte Maxeke hospital?
Yeah.
We just assume, and Lillian Ngoyi Road, right? Yeah. Why is there I even forgot it was William Nicol, that it's now Winnie Mandela Drive. And I think those are the conversations that we need to have in schools. And
it's quite interesting, Katie, because I think there's something that I know, because I've worked with E Cubed, who is a subsidiary of the Department of Basic Education. I know that the educators are not starting, but they've always asked this question. But I've always thought that maybe perhaps what should have been is the same way you have life orientation at school. You should have South African and African studies, or just African studies. I think there should be a segment where we are teaching South Africans about the history of South Africa, who these people are, what are your laws. There are many people walking around. So, for example, with Jared, we focused on defamation today. People don't know the law related to retweeting, liking things that are defamatory in nature. And there are just too many South Africans that have relegated our history to a sub-page somewhere. But our children need to know that, because I think that is important. My son does need to know the history of this country. So does my daughter. And I think those are the things that we have to think about. How do we bring it back into schools, to your point? Because we can't have a generation of South Africans who are completely disconnected to where we come from, how we got here, what are we now, 34 years, 35 years?
No, 31 years. 31 years.
I'm even ahead of everybody. So 31 years of democracy, what does that actually mean?
So you have young kids in school. Do you look at their history books? Do they have any of this?
Well, I mean, from the history stuff at the moment, I don't see any of that stuff. There are some key historical figures turned in relation to their projects. So they'll, for example, my son, who's now in grade 6, he asked me who other than Nelson Mandela, and I mean, that's the one thing that they know, who other than Nelson Mandela was involved. And I said, well, look at people like Steve Biko, look at people like Joe Slovo, and all of that. So he's chosen Joe Slovo, right, to kind of focus on. But the point of the matter is that my son, only his reference point is Nelson Mandela. Nobody else. And
it's sad, because we have such a powerful legacy that stood behind or besides Madiba.
I even said to him, Pixie, one of the founders of the ANC.
Yes.
All of those people, and obviously he chose Joe Slovo, but the point of the matter is the reference point is just Madiba, nothing else.
Yeah. And which is sad, because as parents, we expect the schools to teach this history, because that is I mean, if we looked at our history books, we had those big history
but our
textbooks.
History books were all like kind of European Anglos.
No, it was the Cold War, it was the Anglo-Boer War, it was the Dutch East India Company, those kind of things. But we had those textbooks. Where are our new textbooks that have what we're talking about now? Is that our legacy, our African stories? And I think it's also important for us to know South African stories, but including African stories, because we can't have one without the other. They were part of our...
It was so weird, like you're taking me back to 1950, when I was a
Some
child.
People won't understand the pain.
This was like 40 odd something years ago. But the whole point was that back then we knew about the gold rushes, how Johannesburg as a mining company started. We knew all of those things.
How the spices came to South Africa, the Dutch East India Company.
Very little about our political history, very little understanding of, the people and characters that played a vital role in kind of where we find ourselves.
And because some people, it was the government telling us what we needed to learn. And that was exactly it. Whether it was the news, whether it was in school, that was it. We will tell you what you need to know, and it was control. It was the apartheid government trying to control us, and they did not win because we were part of the resistance.
Well, I don't know if I was part of the resistance. I was seriously unconscious, but I know people like yourself played a much broader role. But it's questions that we've always asked ourselves. Why does the education system look the way it does? And why are our children coming into the world not armed with the right kind of information to be able to push themselves through the challenges?
Yeah. So Women's Month reminds us that we are not finished, like we're saying. We're simply in a new chapter of the same story. And that's what we need to realize, that I remember once I was in Mamelodi and I was speaking to a woman at a leadership event, and she stood up and she said, my grandmother didn't know how to read, but she taught me how to speak up. And she says, even though she now walks into the boardrooms, she's carrying her grandmother's voice. And how powerful is that? Because we have to remember that our matriarchs have contributed positively into our lives. And of course, we spoke about the nurse from KZN who walked 12 kilometers every day in a lockdown. And you know what? She said something so profound. She says, health doesn't take a holiday.
It's very true.
So I think it is important for us to know that young women need to know why we are celebrating our past, and that we did not start from nothing. Because now if you look at it, I always say that I come from queens, conquerors, and survivors. We come from warriors, and most of us come from warriors. And I think these, as much as we talk about legacy, these stories that I'm talking about, these are their stories as well. These are her stories. So to our listeners, maybe your own mother, your own mentor, your own sister are also making up her story. And I think that's the most important thing. So why this matters to us is our platforms today are not necessarily only commemorating history. We are shaping our future. So we're not forgetting, but we are learning to shape our future. And that is what we do with W Suite and most of the other platforms. So we are making visible the gaps where inequalities persist, and it's a constant conversation.
Stubborn.
We're building leadership pipelines across the sectors through our conversations, and we are creating safe spaces for creatives, for economics, and for policy expression. And we ensure that that these structural changes are lasting, and they're not just symbolic victories. It's not like, hey, there's another 50% women in our communities now. So I think the revolution is a continuous revolution. So yes, we celebrate, but we also, again, I speak about this often, we need to continuously mentor young girls. We need to support women-owned businesses. We need to continuously host dialogues on gender-based violence, on equality and opportunities. And we need to hold space for rest, for healing, and for dreaming, because we get so we continuously talking about the big stuff, the heavy stuff. And I said to a friend last night when she was going through, we're talking about some healing, is that, do you know that sometimes we take a break on healing? We're like, today I'll just do it for 1 hour a day. So we need to continuously keep those spaces. So we need to tell our stories. Like I said, we need to create space. We need to build each other. Because like I say, the rooms you will walk in after today need your voice and they need your story. So let's honor the past by not repeating it, but by evolving in it. So I think on the 9th of August, to honor our matriarchs, light a candle, say their name, send a message to them, and share their story, because you're celebrating somebody's mother, you're celebrating somebody's mentor. And also now we celebrate our friends, we're celebrating ourselves, and just light that candle and let's move her story to our future, because that's where we need to get. We come as one, but we stand as thousands. And we remember that march of 20,000 people. Now, on Women's Month, we're creating digital platforms, we're creating event platforms that it's not a march, but it's a continuous conversations, because when one woman rises, we all do. So I think for me, we need to speak boldly about the agenda, and I know that you are one of our great allies, but we need men to continuously speak about holding safe spaces for women, And gender-based violence in our country is not a crime anymore. It's a pandemic.
Yeah, 100%.
And during Women's Month, as much as we often want to talk about economic empowerment, we need to talk about the stuff that is taking away from why we can't be economically empowered. It's the fact is that we don't feel great today. We come from abusive relationships. We come from bullying. We come from harassments. And then you like I say, healing doesn't take a break. Grief doesn't take a break. So we need to have this continuous safe space conversations.
No, absolutely love it. Okay. One thing before you wrap, your show starts tonight.
Yes, the Influence Equation starts tonight.
Tell us a little bit about it and your guest.
I am so excited about this. It's something that I've been working on. I've been talking about the masterclass about how do we start talking about people that have created their equations, because when you have a formula, you're following other people's formula. You create your own influence equation. And often enough, people say, oh, you're so influential, and I'm sure you get this as well. People would like, oh, you're so networked, you have access to people. But how did we do that? We created this equation amongst ourselves, consciously or unconsciously. And it's so the show is really about your voice and your story equals impact, but how did you get there? How did you become of influence, and how did you become influential? So the show is really about, it's bold conversations. It's digging deep into our guests, because I have a guest every week, and it's about how they became who they are. So it's not about, hi, I'm Katie Mohamed, I'm from a little town in Delaney in Richmond, that you can Google. It's experience you can't Google.
It's the layers.
It's the layers. So we're going to talk about what got them to pivot their influence, and so it's going to be really great, because by the end of the show, every guest will tell us about their influence equation and how they got to their influence equation.
And your first guest tonight?
Our first guest tonight is the amazing, the gorgeous, the iconic Sarah Langa. And looking forward to the influence equation at 6 p.m. today on 919.
And it runs till 7. So
yeah,
it's
6 to 7.
Brand new show on our station. Love it. It's called the Influencer Equation. It's our bestie. She's going to run that show for an hour. I'm sure you're excited, right?
I'm super excited.
You're super excited.
It's a dream to actually do this.
And I love it, love it. Okay, final thoughts as we wrap up.
You're not just part of a story, you are the story. So until next time, let's walk tall, speak boldly, and remember that you've been listening to Winning Women Wednesday, and we'll catch you, or we'll see you. No, we'll hear you. We'll catch you tonight and next week on Wednesday. Thank you, Sam.